Hello, everybody. We're just going to wait one more minute before we get started. Welcome and Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the art of purposeful communication. My name is Michael Clausen, Quality Enhancement Specialist for CQL. I've been using and teaching the personal outcome measures since 2012. When I first started using the POMs, I was a case manager working for a provider organization, and at that time, I used the personal outcome measures as a tool for discovery and person-centered planning. Later on, working for the provider, I worked in quality, and at that time, I used the POMs to monitor organizational systems. And I continue to use the POMs in my full-time work with CQL as a tool to support organizations to learn and grow. We've got a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to try to keep it moving along. The intent of this webinar is to cover some of the more advanced interviewing techniques. We will discuss how to get started setting up a personal outcome measures conversation, some of the techniques that are specific to people who communicate differently. We'll talk about what we do during the actual conversation. We'll talk a bit about follow-up and evidence gathering techniques specific to each personal outcome measure. And we will share some additional resources as well. So we do have a full house today, and what we're going to do is have you type your questions into the chat box. So you should have that on the bottom right-hand corner of your control panel. So if you do have a question, just type it right in there. And at the end, we will try to answer as many of those questions as we can. So before we get going with the content here, I just want to do a quick poll just to see who's with us today. So this is a poll about how you use the personal outcome measures. And so we'll have you answer that. So this should pop up on your screen. So I'm going to give you about a minute to answer that poll. Okay, I'm going to share this poll with you just so we can all see who is with us today. Okay, so we got a mixed group today, so that's who's with us. Go ahead and hide that poll. Okay, so one of the things that we will not cover today is decision making. So we do have a webinar series upcoming that is specific to decision making. So you can go ahead and use this URL. That's right on our website under resources, webinars, and you can register for those webinars on decision making. Okay, so getting started with the personal outcome measures interviews, it's really important that you spend some time preparing to ensure your success later on. We're going to talk about explaining the purpose of the conversation, both to the person that you're going to interview, to support staff, and to families. We will talk about the process for obtaining consent, where and when the conversation will be held, how long the interview is going to be, record reviews. So let's start with explaining the purpose of the interview. It's important to remember that people you support and those who support them, along with people's families, may not be familiar with the personal outcome measures interview process. I really like to use this word conversation rather than interview. The word conversation sounds a bit less intimidating, so I really like to use that word conversation. I find that that really puts people at ease. So I really like to discuss what that conversation will look like, who's going to take part in the conversation. I like to talk a little bit about how the organization uses the personal outcome measures. One of the things that you could consider is writing a letter or an info sheet to explain the process of the personal outcome measures interview and why your organization uses the POMs. And it is also helpful to provide a copy of the outcomes overview guide. So this is provided as a handout in this webinar. So if you look at your control panel, you should see the little handouts tab, and you should be able to download it right from that tab if you do not already have it. So it's really important to know what you're going to say before you pick up the phone and call somebody to try to get them to take part in a personal outcome measures interview. I really like to just kind of have a script and say something to the effect of, this is a tool that we use to improve the quality of our services and overall quality for the person, and to monitor how well the organization is doing as a whole. That's kind of the line that I typically use to explain that process. Yours might look a little bit different depending on how you use the personal outcome measures, but something to that effect is what I usually use. But it's important to know what you're going to say before you pick the phone.
Mike, this is Kathy. I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a number of people who are raising their hand. So I don't know if there's a problem, or if, so if you have your hand raised, could you please type your question in the question box, and we'll be able to respond to those. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. We will continue here. We'll talk about the process for obtaining consent. So an authorization to participate in the personal outcome measures process is the equivalent of a consent to release personal information. So keep in mind that the information that you collect, it is private health information, and that is information that is protected. So we want to make sure that we are obtaining consent every time we do a personal outcome measures interview. It's important to follow all of the rules of your organization, any other applicable laws based on where you live. And it's important to involve the person, even if the guardian is ultimately the one who is legally authorized to make that decision. Really, the spirit of the personal outcome measures is to enhance the amount of control people have over their lives and their services. And so we want to keep them involved in the process at all times. And we really want to respect what the person says. So if the guardian says yes and the person says no, well, the answer is no. We really want to respect that. Okay, so where and when, this is important. So while you're setting up this conversation, you're going to talk about where and when that conversation will take place. And from the perspective of being able to gather the most evidence, really the person's home is the best place to have the conversation. However, it's really going to be up to the person where they would like to meet. So we really, again, want to respect their wishes as far as when and where as well. We want to offer to meet with the person wherever they are most comfortable. So that might be their home. Maybe that is at a day program or another service setting. Maybe it's at a coffee shop. There's really no wrong place to conduct an interview, but you do want to keep in mind that wherever you meet with a person, you want to be able to ensure their privacy. There's a lot of value in breaking up the personal outcome measures interview. So you may want to spend some time with the person at their home. Maybe you want to spend a little bit of time with them at another setting where they receive services. What I would say is that you probably don't want to spread the interview out too much. You want to try to keep it all within you know, a somewhat reasonable time period. So try to, you know, start with them and finish the interview, I would say, you know, no later than a month from the time that you first meet with them. Okay, so how long will it take? We get this question a lot, and there's no real, you know, there's no wrong answer to this either. A general time frame, you know, it's really going to depend on how long you've been conducting interviews and how talkative the person is when you're doing the interview. You really want to work with the person to establish how long that conversation will last prior to starting that conversation. And remember, some people are more talkative than others. Some personal outcome measures interviews take longer than others, and that's just kind of the way it goes. But work with the person and agree on a time frame. And once you do agree on that time frame, make sure that you respect that person's wishes and respect their time. So if the person says that they only have 1 hour to spend with you, then make sure that you respect that and stick to an hour. Okay, so the record review. This is a part of the personal outcome measures interview that I do not always do. So it's not always going to be necessary to review the person's record. Really, what you want to keep in mind is that the goal here is to understand how the person defines each of the personal outcome measures. So we're trying to understand the person's perception, and then we try to match that with what their current situation is. The record review is going to be most useful for measuring support. So an example here, if you're looking at best possible health and your follow-up person is unable to tell you whether the person is up to date on their current medical examinations, and sometimes it may be useful to look at their record. And you could also use that to see if the goals written in the person-centered plan matches with what the person told you that their goals were. If you're going to do a record review, always do it last. So that way you don't walk into the interview with any preconceived notions. Okay, so at this point we want to talk a bit about how to have these conversations with people who communicate differently. So before we get into that, I have another poll for you. So we want to know how much more challenging is it to have these conversations with people who communicate differently. So I'm going to launch this poll and give you about a minute to answer it. Okay, so it looks like just about everybody has answered, and I will share the results of this poll just so you can see what everybody thinks about that. So the bulk of you, the majority, find it somewhat more challenging to have these conversations with people who communicate differently. And I would agree with that. I also find it somewhat more challenging to do these conversations with people who communicate differently. So there's reasons for that. It just takes a little bit more skill and technique, and you really have to, I think, just bring your A game a little bit more when you're having these conversations with people who communicate differently. So let's talk a little bit about some strategy here. So what we want to cover is, what do we mean, first of all, by people who communicate differently, whether to have support or no support during the interview, how to coach the support if we are going to have that support with us, and we will talk about the conversation itself. So first of all, what do we mean when we say communicating differently? It's important to remember that some people communicate with words, some people communicate with a device. If that's the case, make sure you find out about that ahead of time. Find out how that person communicates. If it's with a device, make sure that device is available. Some people use interpreters, and if that's the case, we want to make sure that the interpreter is available. Most people use body language to communicate. Some people use written communication. I have done personal outcome measures interviews just by writing back and forth with people, and that works pretty well. Most people communicate in more than one way. The important thing to remember here is that everyone communicates. So even if that communication is not verbal, it's important to understand that everyone does communicate. So we just need to try to figure out how that person communicates and figure out the best way to communicate with them. So we have to make a decision whether or not we are going to have a support person present to assist the person who we're having a conversation with. And so, you know, that decision is just going to be based on a number of factors. It's important to understand that having anybody else present is going to yield a bit of a different experience. So if we must have a support person present during that conversation, consider trying the interview without that support and see how it goes. Maybe you could have them wait outside the place where you're interviewing, and maybe you can bring them in later on. Consider alternatives other than family or staff. So maybe does the person have a friend that can provide support? Is there anybody else? Of course, you know, whenever you're considering whether or not to have support, it's also going to be up with the person. So we really want to get the person's input on this, and we don't bring anybody else in without their permission. So if we do decide to have some support to assist with communication, there's some things that we want to do to coach that support. We want to establish those ground rules before we start the interview. What I like to tell the support person is that they are there to serve as the person's interpreter, and we really want to know what the person thinks, not necessarily what they think. So when having the conversation with people who communicate differently, it's important that we still maintain eye contact and ask questions to the person. So even if there is somebody else present, we still want to look at that person and ask the questions directly to them. We want to be very mindful of the person's body language. So again, what are some of the ways that that person is trying to communicate? We want to use our observations to steer and to guide the conversation, so we can use anything that we see in the environment, any of the observations that we've made to help to steer that conversation along. And we're going to do the same things that we would for everybody else. Okay, so at this point, we want to discuss some of the things that we do during the conversation itself. So we're going to cover how to start the conversation, observations, how to follow the person's lead. We're going to talk about the goal line, suggested questions for the person, the relevance of happiness as a measurement, and some other questions and concepts that have broad applicability. And finally, some techniques to keep the interview going. Okay, so we really want to start these conversations by introducing yourself. That should go without saying, but it's just important that we remember to do that. Explain the personal outcome measures and provide the person with a copy of the outcomes overview guide. Again, you should be able to download that from this presentation. And that's a nice way to kind of explain to the person what the interview is all about. There's a lot of nice pictures in there, and I usually just kind of show them a few of those pictures that are in the book and explain that we're going to talk about relationships and rights and safety and health and the person's goals. You don't have to read every single one of those areas or explain every single one, but it's good to provide an overview. Ask if it's okay to take notes. We want to ensure the person's comfort at all times. So remember, again, to read the person's body language. So if it looks like you're losing the person, then make sure that you do something about that. I really like to start with some warm-up questions and save some of the more challenging areas for later. I typically never start at the beginning. So by warm-up questions, some of the questions that I might ask are, what do you like to do for fun? Or what are your hobbies? I'll ask some seasonal questions as well. Now is a good time, particularly with the holidays. You could ask if people had a good holiday, who did they spend the holiday with? And those are some nice warm-up questions, but they're also very relevant to the personal outcome measures. So if I'm asking somebody about the holidays and who they spent the holidays with, that really leads us right into the area of natural supports. And make sure that you provide assurance to the person. There's no wrong answer, and they do not have to answer all of the questions. And if there's anything that they don't want us to share, that we will respect that. Now, there is an exception to that. If the person tells us about allegations of abuse, or if there's any other evidence of allegations of abuse, or if we think that the person is in danger, then obviously we have to take action about that. So, those are the exceptions to respecting the person's wishes to not share information that they provided outside of the unit. Okay, so observations as evidence. This is very valuable for people who communicate typically and people who communicate differently. Observations are extremely valuable. And again, it's important that we're having these conversations in places where we can make observations, if that's okay with the person. So if you're in a conference room or an office, there's a lot less that you can do in terms of making those observations and using them as evidence for decision making later on. So I like to ask the person to show me around, especially if it's their home. You could have them show you around, depending on their comfort level. Maybe they'll show you their room and where they spend time. We want to pay close attention to the environment while that's happening. So we really want to look at how is the home decorated and furnished. Does it look like a typical home? When we walk in, does the door beep when you open it? If it does, ask why. Ask why the door is beeping. Are there any charts, appointment calendars on the wall? Are there photos of family or others? And again, you can use these as the basis for your conversation. You can ask about that. Who's in the pictures? How often do you get to see them? Does the person have trophies or awards? Is there anything locked up? So if you do see anything locked up, again, you want to ask why. Why is that locked up? Are there any safety considerations? So this one is pretty obvious. Safety considerations, so is there smoke detectors hanging open without a battery in it? Are there blocked exits? That kind of thing. Is the person able to use their environment? So pay close attention to the location of appliances, cabinets. So if a person is using a wheelchair, and then the microwave is pushed way back on the counter, is that person able to use it? So make sure you're paying attention to those kinds of things. And pay attention to smells. Are there cookies baking in the oven? Does the food smell good? Again, does this look like a typical home? So based on these observations, you really want to use them as the springboard for your conversation, so you can talk about the photos that you observed, or if the person has a poster of their favorite baseball team, you can talk about that. And you really want to follow the person's lead. So try to ask follow-up questions that facilitate a segue. So if I'm talking to the person about how they like to go to a hockey game, I can ask them, who do you go with? And then maybe that segues us into friends. Maybe it segues us into family. If the person is telling me about some of their favorite places to go, you could ask who they talk to when they are at those places. You could ask, when you go to that place, how do you stay safe? So you really want to use your questions as a way to guide the conversation, but ultimately the goal here is to allow the person to take you on a journey. And really, we want this to feel like a conversation. It's not a script by any means, so we really want it to be a conversation. One of the most important things that I'd really like to stress is that it's important to know the decision-making questions, or at least have a good understanding of what the decision-making questions are, or maybe you could keep those open during your interview. This is really your goal line. So what I would say is that you shouldn't memorize all of the suggested questions in your book, but you should have a pretty good understanding of the decision-making questions, because this is really your goal. This is really where you need to get to, and you need to be able to make a decision later on. So an example here, if I ask someone who chooses where they work, and they say, my mom, well, you know that that outcome is probably not going to be present if the person doesn't have any options. And so at that point, depending on the purpose of why you're conducting these conversations, you may be able to move on. If you're collecting information just from a data standpoint, then you may be able to move on from that section. Obviously, if you're collecting information for person-centered planning, then you may want to ask some more questions. But it's important that you know where that goal line is, and that you're able to get there through your questions. So let's talk a little bit about the suggested questions. So in your personal outcome measures manual, you'll see there's always a series of questions that say suggested questions for the person. So remember that these are the types of questions that you should be asking. They're not always the questions you should be asking, and they're certainly not the only questions that you should be asking. So we really want to make our questions specific to the person and their situation. So based on what the person tells us, we're going to have different questions just based on that person's situation, the services they receive, where they live, where they work, their relationships, and all of those other things are really going to be what guides us in our questions. So we just need to remember, we really want to make this a conversation. It's not a survey, it's not a script. Okay, so the relevance of happiness as a measurement. we really want to remember that the personal outcome measures are built on choice and control. Avoid asking the question, are you happy with that? So really the personal outcome measures really are not assessing happiness. They're really assessing what choices have people made, what control over those choices have people made. So instead we can ask questions like, who chooses that? Who decides that? Is anyone helping you with that? How are you being supported to do that? So those are really the questions that we want to focus on. What do you want that to look like in the future? Some other concepts with broad applicability. What does a person want to be different about their situation? So you could ask a question like, what would you like to change about that? You really want to assess whether or not the person has been able to make an informed choice. So you can ask, what other options have you had? And remember, for the most part, decision-making is based on present tense. So you really want to make sure that your questions are also in the present tense. So we can ask, who chooses that as opposed to who chose that? Because remember, if the person made a choice 5 years ago and currently they don't have any other options, then there's a good chance that that outcome is not going to be present. So we really want to make sure that our questions are in the present tense as well. Type and frequency. So this one comes up a lot, and this is a strategy that I like to use. It's important to understand that people may not always know that they can have more. So remember, people have not always had the same experiences as we have. They may not always know that they can have more of something. So rather than asking simply, is that enough for you? What I like to do is review that person's situation. So if we're talking about natural supports and how often people get to see their family or other natural supports, what I would do is review what the person told me. So if the person told me that they have a brother and they get to see their brother twice a month and they talk to them on the phone once a week, I would just kind of repeat that back to them and say, well, how much do you want to see your brother? Rather than, is that enough for you? You say, how much of that do you want? And that's a more open-ended way to approach the type and frequency areas. And typically, I think you're going to get more accurate results by approaching it that way. So being content is a lot different than making an informed choice. And really, that's what it's all about. It's about choice and control. Okay, so some of the things that we can do to keep it going. Remember, it's important that if the person tells us that the interview is over, that we respect that person's wishes and we end the interview. But we really need to be mindful of the person's body language at all times. And if we start to lose the person, then we need to take action to make sure that, that we're not going to lose them completely. So again, comfort at all times. We really want to insist on breaks. So it's hard to sit with somebody and talk for 2 hours. It really is, and we really need to be mindful of that. Move around. So remember, the interview does not have to be done sitting at a table or anywhere else. You can move around. You can go for a walk. I know it's really cold where I am right now. It's been in the minuses for the past 7 days, so we probably wouldn't be going for a walk. But during the warmer months, you could probably do that. So don't just sit there. Be creative. Do some things to keep it going, make it fun. Let's talk a little bit about follow-up and some of the techniques that we use. So again, with a follow-up person, we really want to provide some assurance. We want to make sure that we explain that there are no right or wrong answers. We're not here to judge, and we are not looking specifically at what that one person does. We're really looking at supports as the whole. So we're looking at the entire organization. Many of the same techniques that you used with the person are going to be used during the follow-up. Use the question, how do you know? So there are times when you get vague, general kinds of responses to your questions, and I really like to ask, how do you know that? Give me some examples of that. So focus on challenges and solutions. So the personal outcome measures, when you're looking at supports, you can ask about what challenges prevent that from happening. So what challenges prevent the person from having the amount of social roles that they want? What challenges prevent that person from having the contact that they want with their family? And then you can ask follow-ups to that. How do we overcome these challenges? What are some of the things in place that you do that would help that person to overcome that challenge? And follow up with family. So I know that you do have in one of our slideshows, it talks about follow up with family. And I would say that that's pretty atypical. For the most part, your follow up, you're going to want that to be with staff members. They probably have a better understanding of the nuts and bolts of that person's supports. So typically that's who your follow-up is going to be with. Now your follow-up can be with direct support staff or case managers or residential managers, somebody who knows the person well. So at this point, we want to get into some of the more personal outcome measure specific questions, some of the techniques and observations that we use that are more specific to each one of the personal outcome measures. So we'll start with people are safe. And although we don't always go in order when we're having these conversations, we are going to go in order today just for the purposes of these webinars. So with safety, there's a lot of observations that we can make. Again, we can observe safety equipment. We can look at exits. We can look at other people in the environment. We really want to make it person specific. So if the person, if they like to ride bikes, you can talk to the person about bicycle safety. If the person rides the bus, you can talk to them about how they stay safe on the bus. If the, sorry about that. Oops. And you really want to make it person specific. Ask about internet safety. So just depending on what the person does, where they spend their time, that person's unique situation, make it specific to them. Abuse, neglect. So there's a lot of observations we can make here as well. So other interactions in the environment, you're going to look at the person's body language as they are answering these questions. So by that, what I mean is the person telling me one thing with their words, but telling me something different with their body language? Sometimes there are some red flags. And again, you really want to be person specific in this area as well. So just depending on the person's situation, where they live, where they work, where they spend their time, make sure that your questions are specific to that person's individual situation. Okay, so health. With health, we want to cover doctor's appointments, but we also want to focus on the whole person in their situation. So again, what does the person do? What are they interested in? How do they maintain their health given their particular situation? We can ask questions like, who helps you to stay healthy? How are you involved? Again, there's a whole lot of observations that we can make in this area. We can look at health-related equipment or devices. Is the person showing symptoms of something? So there's a lot that we can observe in this area as well. Continuity and security. So with this one, while staff consistency is important, many times we find that people draw stability from their family, their friends, their home, their work, and their interests. So there's a lot of questions that we can ask that are related to that. We can ask questions like, who is there for you? What are some of the things that give you comfort? Again, there's a lot of observations that we can make. We can observe clothing, personal possessions, photographs, and that can help us to understand the person's definition of this and their perception in regards to continuity and security and what gives them stability in their lives. Okay, so people exercise rights. With this one, there is a whole lot that we can observe. Again, we talked about the buzzers on the doors. Are there any charts? So the reason I mentioned charts here is because that anytime there's a chart, whether it's a chore chart or an activity schedule, that kind of thing, those are things that take away control for the person. Now, granted, the person may have had some involvement in creating those things, but we really want to be mindful to that. Are we assigning people chores? Are we assigning them certain activities? And those things really do limit the amount of control that the person has over their life. So you look at those things, look at locks. Does the person carry a wallet or a purse with their ID in it? Does the person have a lock box in their room? Do they have keys? Okay, so these are all things that we can observe. Again, we really want to focus on choice and control. So ask questions like, who chooses? Who decides? And who do you have to ask if? So who do you have to ask if you want some money? Who do you have to ask if you want to go somewhere? So really focus more on day-to-day rights issues. Don't get too caught up in abstract rights concepts. Really focus on those day-to-day. So who chooses your soap? Who chooses your shampoo? Who opens your mail? Okay, so really focus in on those day-to-day rights issues rather than the abstract. People are treated fairly. Okay, so we need to be able to separate this out from people exercise rights. And it's important that we don't just ask, have you ever been treated unfairly? Instead, we want to ask the person how they are treated differently than other people. What are the rules at your home, where you work, etc. If we do find that there is a rights limitation or restriction, we want to ask if that has had due process. Has that person been able to go to the Human Rights Committee meeting to talk about it? We really want to assess that person's perception in a way that is open-ended with this one, and that can be a challenge sometimes. But again, we need to try to understand their perception of this. Okay, people are respected. So again, with people are respected, we typically cover this one last, and because respect is really a culmination of everything else. Okay, so there's a lot of observations that we can make. We can observe interactions with other people in the environment. We can look at decorations, clothing, artwork. And so does the person's decorations, does their clothing, does their artwork, does it convey a sense of status, right? So that's really what this is all about. What is that person's status? How is a higher level of status promoted for that person? Again, we save that one for last. And so keep in mind your decision making for this one too. There's actually a lot of questions, a lot of really good questions that come right from the decision making. One of the ones that I really like to ask is, how are you challenged? How do you learn and grow? Are you allowed to make mistakes? So really those are all key fundamentals when we're talking about respect. People use their environments. Okay, so again, there's going to be a lot of observations that we can make. We talked about some of them already. We want to look at adaptations and modifications, okay? What is the location of that person's appliances, cabinets, okay, light switches, keys and locks, stairs and egress? Is that person able to use all parts of their environment? Some of the questions that I like in this area are, who cooks for you? Who makes your coffee? How do you access that? Okay, so ask a lot of those really person-specific questions based on that person's situation. And you really want to focus on access, not just in the home, but everywhere. So I think while we tend to focus a lot on the person's home, we also want to look at transportation. Is the person supported to access transportation independently? How are they supported to access their community without having to rely on staff? Okay, so with integration, we want to be very mindful of anything that provides visible separation from everybody else. So is there anything that calls attention to the fact that this person receives services? Okay, so we can make some observations relevant to that. Does the home look like others in the neighborhood? Is it a typical neighborhood? Are there markings on vehicles? How are the staff dressed? So, you know, and I do get that sometimes there is a purpose for markings on vehicles, that kind of thing, but we just need to be mindful that that does separate people, and it does call attention to the fact that they're receiving services if your organization's logo is on the van, okay? So this is another area that I typically save for last as well, because a lot of times I find that once I get back to this area, there may be some questions that you don't need to ask, and there's a lot of questions that you probably don't want to ask that, again, the questions in your book, those are suggested questions. One of them is, where do you live and work? So obviously, if you're sitting in the person's living room, then you're not going to ask them where they live, okay? Because that would just be silly, right? So, and really, it's important that you try to understand the person's perception in this area, okay? So ask the person, what are some ways that you are treated differently than other people? Do your services limit you in any way, okay? So really, that's the goal with this one, is to understand the person's perception of integration and how their situation currently matches with that. People participate in the life of the community. Again, there's some good observations that we can make. We can look at photos, memorabilia, clothing. So do they have photos of themselves at places that they enjoy? Is there memorabilia? Are there posters from sports teams or music, that kind of thing? So you can really use those to set up your conversations in this area. And again, I really like to ask, what do you do for fun, okay? And so if I don't observe something that helps me to start the conversation, then I typically start in this area, and I'll just ask a question like that. What do you do for fun? What are your hobbies? Okay, so now that you know where the person goes, we really want to be able to separate this one from participation. So people interact with other members of the community is distinctly different. We're not looking so much at where the person goes. We're looking more at the interaction that the person has once they get there. So some of the questions that we can ask are, who do you talk to when you're at that place? Who knows your name? Whose name do you know? You really want to focus on what relationships the person has or is building in their community. Do you know your neighbors? Those are all good questions. People are connected to natural support networks. So again, some good observations to make here. So we can look at the person's photographs. Do they have cards from the holidays? Do they have address books? Electronic devices. So if you notice that the person has an iPad or a computer, you can ask if they use that to Skype or to FaceTime with their family. And again, keep this specific to the person and seasonally specific as well. I would ask, who do you spend the holidays with? But you know, you could ask, who do you barbecue with in the summer? With friends, we can make some observations, again, photos and mementos. And we really want to try to look to see if the person has opportunities for friendship outside of the service environment. Sometimes there is a tendency on the part of service providers to limit people's potential pool of friends to other people who receive services. So we really want to look to see what opportunities the person has outside of that service environment to have and to build friendships. And again, let's make it specific to the person. So we can ask, based on what the other things that the person told us, if they're interested in baseball, do they go to the baseball game with their friends, or do they watch the baseball game with their friends? We really want to keep it specific to them. With people have intimate relationships, so this area is very complex. There's some observations that we can make, photographs, jewelry. We can ask about goals for relationships. So if the person tells us that they do have a relationship, we can ask, well, where do you want that relationship to go? We really want to approach this in a way that is neutral. So rather than saying something like, do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, I would typically say, do you have a sweetheart? And just keep it neutral. You can also say romance instead of boyfriend or girlfriend. People decide when to share personal information. So again, observations that we can make in this area, we can look, are there binders? Is there technology? So is the person's personal information kept on a computer? Is there any information posted where other people can see it? So be mindful of all of those things. And we really want to ask some individual specific questions in this area. So might be questions like, who decides if we can look at your book? We can ask, what's in your book or binder? All of those questions that would be specific to the person. Okay, so the people choose outcomes. Again, so for all three of these, we really want to make sure that our questions are in the present tense. So again, if the person had choices about where and with whom to live 5 years ago, but they currently don't have any choices, then that outcome is probably not going to be met. So we really want to focus on the present tense. So observations that we can make in this area, are there other people in the home? Do those people live there? Does the person share a bedroom? We can ask about that. And just remember to use questions like, who chooses, who decides, and where do you want to live? So what is your ideal situation? What options do you have? And what information do you have to be able to make that choice? Choose where to work. This is a similar approach. And again, we can observe things like awards from work, photos, paychecks. And I'd really like to ask about what the person's dream job is, okay? So what is your dream job? What would you like to do if you could do anything? And importantly, who decides what you're going to do? And we need to remember also that this is not just about work. We need to include retirement or school or a day program or volunteering. Really, this is all about what the person does during the day, but it doesn't even necessarily have to be during the day. Some people like to work at night. Okay, so with choose services, some of the things that we can observe in this area, magnets, calendars, other business swag, so pens, notepads, etc. We can use those as a basis for our conversation. We really want to look at every place that the person uses their resources. So all of those places where the person spends their money, such as the store or other services, where does the person use their health insurance or other benefits? We really want to think outside the service system and ask who chooses that. So figure out what services the person has. You know, does the person use a bank? Do they use a pharmacy? Do they have doctors, a case manager, hairstylist? And you can ask who chooses those things. So who chooses your bank? Who chooses your pharmacy? Who chooses your doctors? Okay, all of that is fair game in this area of people choose services. People choose personal goals. There is quite a bit we can observe, pretty much everything. Pictures, posters, clothing. There's a lot that we can use. to start these questions and to have this conversation. If you're already at the end of the interview, you should probably already have a pretty good understanding of what the person's goals are. Maybe you know about the person's goals as they relate to work or as they relate to relationships or where they would like to go. So you may already know about some of those things. But you can also ask questions that transcend barriers. So one of the questions that I really like in this area is, what would you do if you had $1 million? I find that that's a question that transcends money as a barrier. So really you're looking at the person's goals. So not just what the person is working on in their plan, but everything. So people want a life, not a plan. So that's really what we want to try to discover in this area. People realize personal goals. Again, there's some observations that we can make. Does the person have medals or certificates or photographs? We can ask, what are you excited about? What gives your life meaning? Have you accomplished anything? So there's some good questions in the book, but again, we want to be specific to that person and their situation. Okay, so that is it for the POM specific conversation. So at this point, we have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about some additional resources to help you to continue to develop your interviewing skills. So one of the things that I suggest is to spend time interviewing with others. I know that when I spend time interviewing with other people, I always pick up something, whether it's a good question that I really like or just a technique that that person uses. I always learn something. So that is a good strategy. And a lot of times what I'll do is when I pick up one of those questions, I will write down in my book so I remember it for later. We have a number of webinars coming up. So those are available on our website. A little bit later this month, we have webinars on decision making, and we have a whole bunch coming up. So check out our webpage and register for those. Check out the e-community on Facebook as well. So if you join our e-community on Facebook, you will be able to ask questions to others who are using the personal outcome measures interview. So if there's one that's particularly tricky or you just want to start a conversation, then you can throw it out there for others to talk about. So check that out. There's lots of good conversations happening on there. The CQL Capstone newsletter is another really good resource that is also on our website. You can sign up for that. And also consider hosting a training workshop or a certification. So if you haven't been through the 4-day personal outcome measures workshop, that is really the best place to be able to learn how to use this tool effectively. So most importantly, what I really want to stress is to have fun. So remember, again, this is not a script. This is not an interrogation. This really is a conversation. So have fun doing it, spend time with people, and make it fun.